The hospital in Beckley, West Virginia smelled like bleach and warmed-up plastic. Fluorescent lights flattened everything, and the hallway noise came in layers: rubber soles, a cartwheel with a bad bearing, a distant monitor keeping time with a steady beep. I'd been walking those halls for days, long enough that the place started feeling routine, which scared me more than the panic ever did. Emma's room sat at the end of a short corridor, curtain half drawn. She looked smaller than she should have, pale in that thin light, hair pulled back, skin too tight around her cheekbones. I kept my face neutral the way you do when you don't want the person in the bed to start managing your emotions on top of their own. I squeezed her hand and tried to be steady, like I had answers instead of guesses. She watched my face like she could read the parts I wasn't saying. A nurse came in, checked the IV, checked the monitor, and tapped notes into a screen like she was counting seconds. "She's stable. That's all I can tell you right now," the nurse said. Stable sounded like relief until you remembered it also meant waiting. More tests, more nights, more charges. I stayed long enough to make sure Emma had what she needed, then stepped out before my voice got soft in a way that would scare her. I found an empty spot by a vending machine, pulled my insurance card, and called the number on the back. The menu chewed up minutes before it handed me a person. I repeated names, dates, and a claim number I'd memorized because it was easier than admitting I was scared. "I'm seeing this as not covered under your plan," the woman said. I stared at the scuffed tile under my boots and forced myself to keep breathing slow. Covered, not covered, like Emma was a line item. "So what am I supposed to do? Just not do it?" I asked. She started talking about appeals and processing time, about forms and business days. I heard the numbers and felt my throat tighten. 60 days, maybe longer. Time I didn't have. I ended the call before my voice did something I couldn't take back. Outside, the cold hit hard, and the parking lot lights made the snowbanks look gray and tired. I sat in my truck with the engine off and let the silence settle. Then I opened the envelopes I'd been avoiding. Itemized statements with numbers that didn't feel real until you added them up. Past due notices, polite threats in professional fonts. I pulled up my banking app and stared at the balance like it might flinch, like it might offer mercy. I wasn't panicking. Panic takes energy. I was running on fumes and stubbornness, and the kind of fear that stays quiet because it knows nobody's coming to fix it. I needed hours. I needed overtime. I needed to keep my job and keep the insurance, and I hated that truth. Losing either one would finish me off. I could either take the next assignment they shoved at me, or I could sit here and watch my life get billed into pieces. Whatever Captain Rawlins offered next, I already knew the answer. I started the truck and drove back toward the station. By the time I pulled into the ranger station lot, the heater was blasting, and my hands were still cold. The hospital smell stayed in my nose like it had crawled in there to live. I kept seeing Emma's face in that flat light, and every time I blinked, I felt the weight of those bills stacking up behind my eyes. By the time I pulled into the lot, the sun was already dropping behind the trees. The building looked the same as it always did, plain and practical, like it had never heard of panic. Inside, the station felt busy in that quiet government way. Phones ringing, printers spitting paper, boots on tile, people talking in half sentences while they walked. I signed a form at the front desk without reading it. I'd learned what mattered and what didn't. Paper never mattered until it did. Captain Rawlins didn't make me wait. One of the clerks waved me down the hall, and Rawlins was already in his office, sitting behind his desk like he'd been there all day. He had a folder in front of him with my name on a tab. I hated seeing my name on a tab. It meant somebody else had been thinking about my life without me. 2 weeks, boundary rotation, Captain Rawlins told me. He said it like he was assigning me to mow a lawn. No build-up, no apology. He flipped the folder open and slid a map across the desk. It was a section I'd heard about but never worked. A stretch of boundary line that ran through thick hollers and over ridges that didn't have clean access points. It was the kind of terrain that made people wander in circles even in daylight, especially if the fog came down. He kept it official. There had been complaints about the line, people arguing about where private land ended and state land started. A couple hikers had gotten turned around near the boundary and needed rescue. Nothing dramatic in the way he said it, just enough trouble to attract attention. He wanted clean logs, clear photos, and no mistakes that would come back on the agency. I stared at the map and tried to keep my face blank. On paper, it sounded like work I'd done 100 times. Walk a line, check markers, photograph conditions, document anything off, keep people from crossing where they shouldn't. It was dull work. It was the kind of work that mattered anyway. Rawlins tapped the folder like it was the answer to everything. He mentioned overtime. Then he mentioned hazard pay, like it was just another line item. My stomach tightened at the word. Hazard pay always meant somebody knew something, and they were trying to make the cost feel reasonable. I nodded anyway because I wasn't in a position to be proud. I didn't feel brave. I felt trapped. My brain did the math automatically. Hours, rate, overtime. The smallest chance of paying a bill before it became a crisis. The smallest chance of keeping Emma's care from turning into a long, slow drowning. I looked at the map again and found the route marked in a thick pen line. The boundaries had names, compartments, numbers. It looked simple. Too simple. "Where's Jesse Rigsby?" I asked. Rawlins didn't look surprised. That's what bothered me. He didn't blink like it was a normal question, but there was a pause, just long enough to feel like he was checking which lie to use. "Transferred," he said flatly. I held his gaze, waiting for him to add anything else. A reason, a place, a timeline. Anything that sounded like a real transfer. He didn't. He picked up a pen and pointed at the map again, redirecting the conversation like I'd asked about a stapler. I knew the move. It was management. Keep it narrow. Keep it simple. Keep the worker focused on the task instead of the why. Most days I could play along. That day, it hit different. Jesse Rigsby wasn't a rumor. He was a name I'd seen on reports. He was a guy who knew the woods. Guys like that didn't vanish from a rotation for no reason. Rawlins handed me a keyring and a laminated access card. One of the keys was old and worn. Another one looked brand new, sharp edges, clean cuts. The new key made my skin itch. He added details in that same flat tone. Night checks, walk the boundary line, confirm markers, photograph the stones, log everything, no freelance, no improvising. He didn't say it like a warning. He said it like a policy. That was almost worse. "Do it exactly by the book," he told me. I stared at him for a second, then looked down at the folder. There were forms, a schedule, and a single page that looked like it had been copied too many times. The text was blurred in places. Somebody had stapled it to the inside cover like they didn't want it drifting away. "What book?" I asked. Rawlins didn't answer with a title. He didn't slide a manual across the desk. He just tapped the keyring with one finger and nodded toward the door, like the next part of the conversation was going to happen out there, whether I liked it or not. I took the folder, shoved it under my arm, and stood up. My knees felt stiff, like my body was trying to slow me down. I walked out of his office and down the hall, past bulletin boards full of safety posters and faded notices. For a second, I thought about refusing. Not because I didn't want the work, because something about the way Rawlins said transferred didn't sit right. But then I saw Emma again in my head, and the thought died. Refusing was a luxury. Luxuries were for people who didn't have hospital bracelets in their family. I loaded my gear, grabbed extra batteries, grabbed my field bag, grabbed my camera. Then I drove. Appalachia swallowed signal fast. One bar became none. The road narrowed until there wasn't much shoulder. The fog rolled in like it had been waiting. Trees crowded close on both sides, bare branches clawing at the gray. Every few miles, I passed a pull-off with a rusted sign and a trailhead that looked like it hadn't seen a smiling hiker in a long time. I kept the map on the passenger seat, folded open to the section Rawlins had marked. The boundary line cut through steep terrain and deadfall and old stone markers that didn't show up in any GPS app. I knew that because my phone tried to load a map twice and then gave up like it was offended. The deeper I drove, the quieter everything got. Not peaceful, just empty. My tires hummed on wet pavement. The world outside the headlights was a wall of tree trunks and fog. The cabin sat off a gravel spur road that looked barely maintained. A small wooden building, one story, low roof, porch sagging just a touch. The sign out front was weathered enough that you could tell it used to say something official, but now it mostly just said neglect. The place should have felt abandoned. It didn't. The lock on the front door was new. Not a fresh coat of paint new. New like it had been installed yesterday. The metal gleamed in my flashlight beam. I stood on the porch for a second and listened. No animals, no wind chime, no human sounds, just my own breathing and the faint creak of wood. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The cabin smelled like pine cleaner and dust, like someone had tried to scrub the place until it felt neutral. The radio desk was clear. The counters were wiped. The floor looked swept. There were no dirty dishes, no abandoned coffee cups, no half-finished notes. It was too tidy for a cabin that was supposed to be actively used. It felt staged, like a model home, like someone didn't want the next person to imagine the last person was real. I set my bag down and walked through the small rooms. Bunk, table, map board, a propane heater in the corner, a few cabinets with basic supplies, everything lined up, everything put away. It should have been reassuring. Instead, it made my neck prickle. Then I saw it. A drawer under the radio desk, sealed shut with strips of old tape, layered over itself like whoever did it had kept adding more every time it peeled. The tape was yellowed, but the tears in it looked recent. Someone had fought with it. Someone had wanted it closed. I stood there and stared at that taped-shut drawer until the cabin felt colder. That was the final detail that tipped everything from normal assignment into something else. I didn't know what the book was yet. I just knew it was waiting for me in there. I didn't open that drawer right away. I unpacked first, like doing normal things could make the cabin feel normal. I set my field bag on the table. I hung my jacket on the back of a chair. I checked the propane heater and made sure it would light. I tested the overhead bulb and listened to it buzz. The cabin was quiet in a way that made every small sound feel louder than it should have. Then I went back to the radio desk and looked at the tape again. It was layered thick, old strips crossed over newer ones, corners curled where someone had peeled at it and then slapped it back down. The drawer handle had adhesive smeared around it like a thumbprint. Whatever was in there, somebody had wanted it shut. That didn't mean it was dangerous. It could have been paperwork. It could have been a spare key. It could have been nothing. But the taped seam made my skin crawl anyway. I gripped the handle and pulled. The tape held for a second, then tore with a dry ripping sound that felt too loud in that small room. The drawer slid out halfway and caught. I tugged again, and it opened fully. Inside was a single stack of papers, folded and clipped, with the top sheet facing up like it was meant to be found. The paper was typed, the font plain, the kind you'd see in a training memo. But the margins were crowded with handwritten updates, different ink, different pressure. Some notes were neat, careful, like someone trying to stay professional. Other notes were jagged, rushed, like they'd been written with shaking hands. I didn't read it yet. I laid it on the desk and forced myself to do what I always did before a night check. I inventoried my gear. I poured salt into small zip bags so I could grab one without fumbling. I cut strips of reflective tape and looped them around my fingers so I could hang them fast. I checked my logbook and made sure my pen worked. I wrote my name at the top out of habit. Brady Whitaker. I unfolded the paper map Rawlins had given me and taped the edges down so it wouldn't flap around. I turned my GPS on and watched it acquire signal, slow and stubborn. I tested my flashlight and swapped in fresh batteries. I checked the radio, adjusted the volume, and listened to the static settle into a steady hiss. It all felt familiar. It was the kind of routine that kept you safe, even when the work was boring, even when the work wasn't. When I was done, I picked up the checklist and read the first line, then the second. Then I stopped, because it didn't read like a joke. It didn't read like folklore. It read like procedure. It read like someone had tried everything else and gotten burned. I told myself the same thing I'd told myself 100 times in this job. You don't argue with paper in the field. You argue later, when you're home and warm and alive. Out here, you follow the simplest plan that keeps you moving. I keyed the radio and did a check-in, partly because I needed to hear another human voice. "You got your logbook?" she asked. "Yeah," I said. "Then write everything down and don't freelance," she said flatly. I didn't ask her to explain. I could tell she wouldn't. Her voice had that clipped tone people get when they've already learned something the hard way. The kind of tone that says, "I'm trying to keep you breathing, not make you feel better." I stared at the checklist again and felt my throat tighten. "Is this normal?" I asked. "No," she said. "Just one word. No warmth, no pause, no, but you'll be fine." It landed heavier than it should have. I took a slow breath, then read the list out loud once, like saying it would pin it to reality. First rule, if you hear the thin whistling, stop. Look down at your boots. Turn back on your own tape markers. Don't look for the source. Second rule, if a boundary stone feels wet, cold, and dry air, don't touch it. No gloves, no tools. Salt a closed circle around the base. Log the time. If the salt disappears, leave. Third rule, fix one stone per night, only one. If you fix more, you're helping it move faster. Fourth rule, if your GPS says you're outside the preserve, believe it. Walk back the shortest way without arguing with what you see. Fifth rule, if you see bare footprints coming from deep woods to the line, turn around. Don't call out. Don't search. Sixth rule, if someone asks, "What county is this?" and they don't blink, say, "You're not on a road. I can't guide you." Step back 9 steps. Leave. When I finished, the cabin felt smaller. The air felt thicker. I stared down at the page and tried to picture a scenario where any of that would be necessary. Thin whistling, wet cold stone and dry air, bare footprints coming out of deep woods like somebody walked out and then got erased, a person who didn't blink, who asked what county they were in like they'd been dropped in from somewhere else. The handwritten notes in the margins made it worse. A short underline under the word leave, a shaky arrow pointing at only one, a scribble beside the GPS line that just said, "Trust it." No explanation, no story. Just the kind of emphasis you add when you've watched someone die for doing the opposite. I folded the checklist once and set it back on the desk. My hands were steady, but my stomach wasn't. I kept thinking about the tape on the drawer. Whoever sealed it shut hadn't been trying to protect me from a ghost story. They'd been trying to keep this paper from being treated like a rumor. And what scared me most was how practical it all sounded. Not the words themselves, the intent behind them. Whoever wrote this wasn't afraid of the dark. They were afraid of improvising. They were afraid of making the wrong choice in the wrong moment, afraid enough to boil it down into 6 rules and hope the next person was smart enough to listen. I started the log the way I always did, with the boring things that mattered later. Overcast sky, damp air, cold enough that the metal on my flashlight felt sharper in my hand. A light wind moving through the trees, not strong, just constant. No rain yet, but the kind of night where it could start without warning and turn every slope into a slide. I wrote it in my own shorthand, the kind that made sense to me and to anyone who'd ever had to explain themselves after something went sideways. I laid everything out on the cabin table and forced myself to slow down. Extra batteries in one pocket, spare set in another. Flashlight tested twice. Headlamp tested once, then again after I adjusted the strap. Salt bags on the left, tape on the right, because I didn't want to be digging for anything in the dark. The paper map stayed folded to the section Rawlins had marked, edges taped down so the fold wouldn't fight me. The GPS sat on the desk where I could grab it without looking. I checked the camera like it was a tool that could save my job. Lens wiped clean, spare SD card in my jacket pocket. I took one test photo of the map on the table, made sure it saved, then deleted it. I didn't want clutter. I wanted clean evidence that lined up. I keyed the radio and kept my voice even, like that could set the tone for the night. "Main line check starting. East side," I said. "Copy. Keep it tight," she said. I stepped out onto the porch and locked the cabin behind me. The lock clicked clean, too clean for an old door, and I didn't love that. The porch boards creaked under my boots. Beyond the railing, the woods were black and wet-looking, even where there wasn't water. Fog hung low between the trunks, not thick enough to hide anything, just thick enough to soften the edges. The air smelled like leaf rot and cold dirt. The first stretch I chose was the easiest on purpose. That wasn't cowardice, that was procedure. You start with the segment you can control, the one close enough to the cabin that you can turn back without making a decision you'll regret. If something feels wrong early, you don't push deeper to prove a point. You back out, you regroup, you live long enough to come back with daylight and help. The trail out of the cabin wasn't an official hiking path. It was a service cut, an old line used by rangers and survey crews, worn into the ground by boots and occasional tires years ago. It ran along the ridge for a while before it angled down into a shallow hollow. The ground was slick in places. Leaves stuck to my soles. I walked slower than normal, keeping my steps quiet, listening as much as watching. Night woods have a rhythm. You hear it if you work in them enough. Insects chirp in patterns. A distant owl calls and then goes quiet. Small things move through brush and stop when you stop. None of it is spooky by itself. It's just life. The only time it becomes scary is when the rhythm changes, and you don't know why. I didn't have that yet. Not at first. I stopped at the first place where the boundary line came close to the service cut. There was an old wooden post with faded paint and a small reflective tag nailed to it. On the map, it was a reference point, nothing more. I pulled out my tape and tore off a strip, then wrapped it around a branch at shoulder height, making sure the reflective side faced the direction I'd be coming back from. That mattered. Tape you can't see is tape you didn't hang. My method was simple. I didn't trust memory in the dark, and I didn't trust the woods to stay the same. I trusted what I placed with my own hands. Every marker went at a height my flashlight beam would catch naturally. Every marker faced back toward my return path. Every marker was spaced close enough that I'd see the next one from the last, even if fog thickened. If I couldn't see the next marker, I didn't move forward until I had one in place. It wasn't fancy, but it worked. It had kept me out of trouble more times than I could count. I walked a little farther and found the first boundary stone. It was half buried and worn, just a rough chunk of rock with a number carved into it that you'd miss if you weren't looking. Moss clung to one side. I brushed it lightly with the back of my glove and leaned in to read the carving. The number matched the map. The stone sat where it should. I took a photo from a few angles, not because I expected to need it, but because I wanted a baseline. If something shifted later, I'd have proof of what normal looked like. Then I wrote a short note in the log. Stone intact, number legible, no obvious movement. I moved on. The next stretch was more of the same. Trees packed tight, the ground rising and falling in small, annoying ways that make you work for every 100 yards. The fog drifted in and out like it couldn't decide where it wanted to be. My light caught floating threads of it. The beam felt shorter than it should have. I told myself that was moisture in the air, nothing else. After a while, I checked the GPS, mostly out of habit. The screen showed my position close to the line, which was what I wanted. The arrow drifted a few yards to the side, then snapped back. It happened fast enough that most people wouldn't notice, but I did. I watched it do it again, a slow slide like the device was thinking about lying, then a correction like it got caught. I didn't panic. GPS drift happens, tree cover interferes, terrain messes with signal. Satellites don't care about your night shift. I logged it the same way I'd log a headlamp flicker. Minor drift, corrected, no action needed, just awareness. I keyed the radio. GPS drift, minor, I said. Log it, she told me. I am, I said. I kept walking. The next stone was about the same, worn but solid. Carving matched, no weird temperature, no wet sheen, just a rock in the ground doing its job. I photographed it, wrote another note, and kept moving. The night stayed quiet. Not silent, quiet. There's a difference. I heard a deer somewhere downslope, heavy steps in leaves. I heard a branch crack in the distance, and then nothing, which usually meant whatever made the sound had noticed me and decided to wait. I heard the faint rush of water from a creek I couldn't see. My breathing sounded loud in my own ears, but I didn't feel hunted. I felt like a guy doing his job. Still, every so often, my mind tried to slide back to that checklist sitting on the desk. Paper shouldn't have weight, but that one did. Thin whistling, wet cold stone, bare footprints, don't freelance. Trust the GPS, step back 9 steps, leave. I kept my thoughts on the work because thoughts were cheap and mistakes weren't. I dropped another tape marker at a bend where the service cut got narrow and the undergrowth thickened. This one went on a sapling close to the trail, tight and clean. I pulled on it once to make sure it wouldn't slip. It held. A little deeper in, the woods tightened up. The trees looked closer together. The brush looked thicker. It wasn't dramatic. It was just that small, annoying shift where you start taking shorter steps because you don't like what your ankles might find. I watched my footing and watched my tape. The reflective strips blinked back at me when my beam hit them. That was comforting in a simple way. I'd made those. They were mine. I found a spot where the boundary line ran close enough that I could check 2 stones without leaving the service cut. That was good. It meant I could confirm more without pushing into the steeper terrain. I photographed both stones, steady hands, clean framing, nothing artistic. Then I wrote it down. Normal, normal, normal. Those were the entries you wanted. When you do this right, most of your shift is boring. Boring is a gift. I turned back toward the cabin before I got ambitious. The plan was to get a clean pass on the easy section, then decide if I'd push farther after. I followed my tape markers back, one to the next, letting my light find the reflective flashes so my brain didn't have to work too hard. Halfway back, I stopped to adjust one marker that sat a little too low. I'd hung it fast and didn't like the angle. I reached out, took the strip between my fingers, and paused. It was twisted, not the kind of twist you get from wind. Tape doesn't spin itself around a branch and tuck its reflective face away like it's hiding. This was turned almost perfectly backward, like someone had taken the time to rotate it so I wouldn't see it on the return. I stared at it for a long second and tried to think of a normal reason. Maybe I'd hung it wrong. Maybe I'd rushed and not noticed. Maybe the branch shifted. Maybe an animal brushed it. Those were all possible, technically. None of them felt right. I didn't say anything into the radio. I didn't want to sound jumpy. I didn't want to give the woods my fear, even if that was just superstition. I corrected it, making sure the reflective side faced me again, and I tightened it until it cut into the bark slightly. Then I made a note in the log. Marker found rotated. Corrected. Possible wind or contact. Monitor. As I walked, I kept checking the next markers. They looked fine. That one was the only one that looked wrong. That made it worse. If wind did it, why only one? If an animal did it, why so neatly? Why like a hand? I kept moving anyway because standing still in the woods is how your mind eats you. Back at the cabin, I didn't go inside right away. I stood on the porch and listened. The fog had thinned slightly, but the woods were still dark. No whistling, no voices, no footsteps, just the low rustle of leaves in the distant creek. I went inside, wrote a few more lines in the log, and checked my gear again like I was resetting myself. Batteries still good, salt bags untouched, tape supply fine, my hands didn't shake. That was something. Then the radio hissed. It wasn't a call. It wasn't Nikki. It was just a sudden spike of static like someone brushed the mic. I looked at it, waiting for a voice. Nothing came. The hiss dropped back to normal. A minute later it happened again, and this time it had a shape to it. A soft inhale, like somebody breathing too close to the speaker. It was faint, and if I wanted to dismiss it, I could have blamed interference. But it didn't sound like interference. It sounded like a person trying to be quiet. I leaned closer, listening, and my stomach tightened. Then it was gone. I didn't touch the radio. I didn't speak. I just watched the red power light and waited for Nikki to break in like she always did when something needed doing. The channel stayed empty. I told myself the obvious. Old equipment, moisture, electrical noise, my own imagination. The cabin was in the middle of nowhere, and your brain fills silence with whatever it can find. Still, I wrote it down. Radio static spike, possible breath-like noise, no voice transmission. I sat on the edge of the bunk and stared at my boots for a second, thinking about Rule 1. Look down at your boots. Turn back on your own tape markers. Don't look for the source. That line made more sense in my head than I wanted it to. I stood up and decided to do one more short pass outside. Not far. Just enough to confirm the markers nearest the cabin were still in place. I told myself I was being thorough, not nervous. Maybe that was true. Maybe it wasn't. The porch boards creaked again as I stepped out. The air had gotten colder. The fog had come back in low, pooling between the trees. My flashlight beam cut a narrow tunnel through it. I walked to the first marker and shined my light on it. It faced the right way. I touched it lightly with my knuckle, felt it firm, and moved to the next. Everything looked normal. That should have made me relax. It didn't. Somewhere out in the trees, thin and distant, a faint whistling started up. It wasn't loud. It wasn't close. The sound held one note, then shifted slightly, like someone testing their breath. My feet stopped before my brain finished deciding. My light froze on the tape marker in front of me. The sound came again, a little clearer this time, and every hair on my arms lifted under my jacket. I didn't look for it. I didn't swing my flashlight around. I did exactly what the paper said to do. I looked down at my boots and held still. I stayed like that longer than was comfortable, eyes on my boots, beam of my flashlight pinned to the ground in front of me. The whistling held steady, thin and careful, like whoever was making it was trying not to waste breath. It wasn't the kind of sound you hear by accident. It had intent. It had patience. My first impulse was to lift my light and sweep the trees. That's what your body wants. Find the threat, name it, put it in a box. But Rule 1 wasn't telling me to find anything. It was telling me to stop, look down, and go back the way I came. So I did what I'd already started. I checked my boots. At first it looked normal, leaves, mud, the edge of the service cut. Then I noticed what I should have noticed earlier. The tape marker that was supposed to be straight ahead was off to my right, just far enough that my beam didn't catch it unless I angled the light. My stomach tightened as the simple truth clicked into place. I'd drifted. Not a lot. Not enough to get lost on a normal night, but enough that I wasn't walking the line I'd laid for myself. Enough that I'd stepped out of the safe lane without realizing it. When you work in the dark, you trust patterns. You trust that your next step is the same kind of step you took a minute ago. And if you're tired, if your brain is on autopilot, You can slide sideways without feeling it happen. I stared at my boot prints in the damp leaves and measured it the way I measured everything. A step and a half. That's all it was. One careless drift, one small angle change, and I was outside my own markers. The whistling came again, a little clearer, and I felt the stupid urge to look up, to prove to myself I wasn't being played by a sound. I swallowed it down. I kept my eyes low and forced myself into a routine. Routine is how you keep fear from driving. I counted my steps backward. 1, 2, 3. I didn't rush. Rushing is how you trip, and tripping is how you lose your light, and losing your light is how you die in a way nobody understands. I took deliberate steps and watched for my tape. When my beam finally caught the reflective strip straight ahead, the tension in my shoulders eased just a fraction. I stepped toward it, touched the branch lightly, and kept moving back along the line I'd made. Each marker showed up the way it should. Each reflective flash felt like a small promise. The whistling didn't stop right away. It followed, distant, steady, as if it didn't care where I was, only that I was doing what I was told. That bothered me. It wasn't a predator stalking, it was something else, a test, a pressure, like it wanted to see if I'd break my own rules. I made it back to the cabin without doing anything stupid. I locked the door, set my gear down, and stood at the radio desk for a second with my hands braced on the wood. My heart wasn't racing, not yet. It was that colder kind of fear, the kind that sits behind your ribs and makes your thoughts feel sharp. I keyed the radio. "I heard the whistle," I said. "Did you look for it?" she asked. "No," I said. "Good," she said flatly. Her tone didn't change. No surprise, no questions, like this was expected, like she'd been waiting for me to say those exact words. I could have asked her what it meant. I could have demanded an explanation, but I already knew what I'd get. A short answer. A shut door. Nikki wasn't there to give me comfort. She was there to keep me alive long enough to get off that line. I wrote a quick entry in the log, not fancy, not dramatic. First occurrence of thin whistling. Stopped. Looked down. Confirmed drift off tape line by approximately 1.5 steps. Returned to markers. No visual contact. I sat for a minute, letting the heater click and hiss. Then I forced myself back into motion. The rules didn't say to hide in the cabin. They said what to do when things happened. If this was a test, the worst thing I could do was freeze and let the night get inside my head. I decided to make one more controlled check, close to the main line, close enough that I could turn back fast if I needed to. I kept it practical. I didn't chase the sound. I didn't wander. I followed my own tape like it was a rail. Outside, the fog had thickened. Not enough to blind me, but enough to make the woods feel closer. My light hit tree trunks and died quick. The air tasted damp and metallic. I moved slowly, scanning the ground for anything that didn't belong. The whistling came and went, faint, like a signal that never fully committed. It didn't spike my panic anymore. It sharpened my focus. It made me stubborn. It made me determined not to be the guy who got tricked into doing something stupid because he wanted answers. Near the main line, I found a boundary stone I'd photographed earlier. I recognized the moss on one edge. I recognized the way the carving sat slightly crooked, like whoever cut it had been in a hurry. I knelt and shined my light on the number. It was still the same number, but the stone didn't sit the same way. It had shifted. Not far, a few inches maybe. Enough that the base was more exposed on one side, like it had been tugged or rocked. In a place like this, there were normal explanations. Freeze and thaw can move stone. Water can undermine soil. A deer can rub against it. A hiker can kick it by accident. That was the kind of movement you'd see over months, though, not overnight. Still, it was believable. It was the kind of thing you'd actually fix on a boundary check. And the rules had a line for that. Fix 1 stone per night, only 1. I felt my brain wanting to negotiate with that. If 1 is good, why not 2? If the line is shifting, why not reset more? make it right, do my job. But I could still see the underlined note in the margin of the checklist. Only one. Like somebody had learned that lesson in blood. I repeated it in my head, plain and ugly. 1 stone. That's it. I didn't touch the rock yet. Rule 2 came first. If it feels wet, cold, and dry air, don't touch it. Salt a closed circle. Log the time. If the salt disappears, leave. The air around me was cold, but my gloves weren't damp. The leaves weren't wet. There wasn't rain. I reached out and hovered my bare fingers near the stone without touching. I could feel the cold radiating off it, but that wasn't unusual for rock at night. It didn't feel alive. It didn't feel slick, not wet cold. I pulled one of my salt bags, tore the top open, and poured a thin line around the base. I made it a full circle, careful to close it, no gaps. It looked ridiculous, like some kind of superstition. But I wasn't here to be proud. I was here to follow procedure that someone else wrote for a reason. I waited. Nothing happened. The salt stayed where it fell, bright against the dark soil. No sinking, no dissolving, no vanishing. The woods didn't react. My breath stayed steady. I let myself exhale slowly. If the salt had disappeared, I would have left. No debate. But it didn't. That meant I could proceed. I set my light down so it shone across the stone, and I put both hands on the rock. I braced my boots in the leaves and applied steady pressure, not jerking, not wrestling. The stone scraped against soil with a dull, gritty sound. It moved back into place like it wanted to, like it had only been nudged out of alignment. When it settled, it felt solid. I pressed down, tested it. It didn't wobble. I took photos, same angles as before. Close shot of the carving, wider shot that showed surrounding landmarks. My hand stayed steady because my brain had turned the situation into a task. Tasks are easier than fear. Then I wrote it down. Boundary stone near main line found slightly displaced. Salt test performed. No disappearance. Stone reset. Photos taken. I stood, flexed my fingers, and looked around. The fog drifted between the trees. The whistling was gone for the moment. The woods looked like woods again. Ordinary. Uninterested. I should have turned back right then. I did turn back, but on the way, I saw something that made my throat go tight. Bare footprints. They weren't on the service cut. They came out of the deep woods, angled toward the boundary line like the person had been walking straight through brush and deadfall without caring what tore at their skin. The prints were clear in a patch of damp soil, toes and heel defined, the stride even. Whoever made them wasn't limping. They weren't stumbling. They were moving with purpose. The footprints led right up to the line, then stopped. Not like they turned, not like they faded. They just ended. The soil beyond was undisturbed, like the person had lifted off the ground and vanished. No scuff marks, no extra step, no sign of a jump, just an abrupt absence. I stood there staring at it, and my brain tried to make it normal. A trick of soil. An animal track that looked human. Somebody wearing those weird barefoot running shoes. Anything. But the toe marks were too clean. The spacing was too human. And the direction was wrong. They weren't coming from the trailhead. They were coming from deep woods that nobody walks into at night unless they're lost, or running, or not human. Rule 5 hit me like a shove. If you see bare footprints coming from deep woods to the line, turn around. Don't call out. Don't search. I didn't argue. I didn't stand there and think about being helpful. I didn't yell to see if someone answered. I turned around immediately, pivoting on my heel, and I walked back along my tape markers without looking over my shoulder. My pulse started climbing then. Not full panic, but fast enough that I felt it in my throat. My flashlight beam shook just a little, and I forced it steady with both hands. I kept my steps measured. I kept my eyes on the next marker. I didn't let my imagination fill the dark behind me. Halfway back, the thin whistling returned, faint and distant, and then it stopped, like someone had flipped a switch. By the time I reached the cabin porch, the woods were quiet again, not peaceful, just waiting. I went inside and locked the door. My hands were cold, and not just from the air. I set my gear down and wrote one more entry in the log. Bare footprints observed approaching boundary line from deep woods. Abrupt stop at line. No continuation. Followed Rule 5. Immediate withdrawal. No contact. I sat on the edge of the bunk and stared at my boots until my breathing slowed. The heater clicked. The radio stayed quiet. The cabin smelled like cleaner and old wood. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel brave. I felt like I'd walked through an invisible fence and lived because I didn't touch it twice. That was the moment it settled in, heavy and simple. The rules weren't superstition. They weren't a joke. They weren't folklore somebody tacked onto a government job to scare the new guy. They were a fence, and whatever they were fencing off, it was close enough to test me. Emma looked a little better that morning. Not healed, not magically fine. Just enough color in her face that I could pretend the trend was going the right way. I kept my visits short and my words normal. I didn't tell her about the rules, the whistling, or the footprints that stopped at the line like the ground had erased the rest. I didn't put that on her. That night I drove back up the spur road. Fog sat thicker over the gravel spur when I returned. The cabin looked the same. One story, old boards, sagging porch, except for that new lock catching my light like a warning. I set up the same way because routine was the only thing that made me feel like a ranger instead of a guy guessing. Batteries checked, flashlight tested, salt bags counted, tape strips ready, map open, logbook open. I started with the easy segment again, close to the cabin, close to my own markers. I wanted one clean pass before I pushed anywhere else. The first stones looked fine. My tape blinked back at me. The woods sounded like woods, distant water, insects, a bird call that faded off. For a while it almost felt normal. Halfway through the pass, the radio snapped alive. The voice sounded like Captain Rawlins, same gravel, same clipped pace. He said someone was lost near the boundary line, and he needed me to push past my marker and check the far side. He made it sound urgent, like minutes mattered, like the station was already taking calls and my job was to move. That was the first problem. Rawlins didn't do urgent. Rawlins did liability. When he cared, it was because paperwork might come back on him. This voice sounded like it cared about a person, and that alone made my skin prickle. I tested it with simple questions, the kind you ask without sounding like you're accusing anyone. Which trailhead? Which parking lot? What time the call came in? Any known medical issues? What segment name I was assigned tonight? The label from the folder. The answers came back fast, but each one was off by a notch. A trail name almost right. A time that didn't match how long the station would have waited before calling me. A segment label that was close to mine, but not mine. It felt like someone had listened to the right conversations and memorized the wrong details. It wasn't proof. It was friction. The feeling of a familiar voice missing the shape of real information. The worst part was the hook it used. Someone lost. Someone cold. Someone who might be alive right now and dead in an hour. That's the kind of thought that makes every rule feel selfish. It turns procedure into cowardice. It turns staying safe into leaving someone behind. I stood there with my glove on the radio, looking at my tape marker ahead, and I hated that I couldn't be sure. If this was a trick, it was a smart one. If it wasn't, I was the only person close enough to make a difference. I keyed the radio and forced my voice steady. "That's not the plan," I said. "Plans change," he said flatly. I stared at my last tape marker. Reflective face aimed back toward the cabin, exactly the way I'd placed it. Beyond it was fog and trees and whatever made people write rules like a last will. I told myself I'd do the responsible thing. A quick check. A few steps past, look for signs, then write back. I wouldn't wander. I wouldn't touch any stones. I just needed to know I hadn't let a real person die because I got spooked. I stepped past the marker, one step, then another. The woods didn't look different, but the air felt colder, like I'd walked into a damp pocket. The night sounds softened, not gone, just muted, like the world had leaned away. I swept my light over the ground. No prints, no torn cloth, no dropped pack, just leaves and dark soil. I stopped. That was enough. I turned back and my tape marker looked farther than it should have. Not impossible, just wrong, like distance had stretched while my back was turned. I walked toward it and felt like I was moving through thicker air. The fog seemed to thicken exactly where my beam tried to cut through, like the light was getting tired. I checked the GPS. The arrow slid sideways, snapped back, slid again. Typical drift, except it happened with a stubbornness that made my stomach drop, like the device couldn't decide what side of the line it wanted me on. I grabbed the tape marker like a handrail. I told myself that was it. I'd checked, I'd done my duty, I'd go back and call it in. I even started to pivot toward the cabin. That's when I felt someone watching. Not a sound, not a movement, just the pressure of attention. I lifted my light, slow, and found him standing ahead of me, just inside the boundary line. He wasn't hidden. He wasn't moving. He was simply there, placed like a sign. My flashlight caught a pale face and still eyes. He didn't blink. He didn't squint. He didn't react like living people react when a bright beam hits them. His breath didn't show in the cold. "What county is this?" he asked. A lost person would have asked for help. This sounded like someone practicing being human. I answered like the paper told me to. "You're not on a road. I can't guide you," I said. I stepped back 9 steps, counting because counting kept my legs from running. The county man didn't follow. He just watched, head slightly tilted, like he was waiting for the next part. Then he said my line back to me, and the emphasis was wrong, like a student copying a sentence without understanding it. "You're not on a road. I can't guide you," he repeated. My chest tightened, my beam shook, and I forced it steady. I didn't call out. I didn't ask if he was hurt. I didn't do anything that would turn this into a conversation, because the rules were clear about what conversations cost. I looked down at the GPS because Rule 4 was sitting in my head like a weight. The screen flashed and settled on 2 words. Outside, preserve. My eyes snapped up. I was staring at my own tape marker. The service cut was behind it. Everything said I was still on my side of the line, but the GPS said I wasn't. I tried to follow the GPS anyway. I took a step the way it pointed, and the arrow swung, then swung again, pulling me away from the cabin. My tape markers were honest and clear. The GPS wanted fog. The radio hissed once, like somebody breathed into it, and then went dead quiet. I stopped, caught between my eyes and the rule, caught between rescue and procedure. If there really was a lost hiker, hesitation mattered. If there wasn't, one wrong step could trap me. And the county man stood there, still and patient, like he didn't need to chase anything, like the line did the work for him. That's when I saw a boundary stone off to my left, half buried and tilted. If I reset it, I could tell myself I was doing my job. I could pretend correcting the line would correct the night. I could pretend the GPS would settle if the boundary was right. Rule 3 burned in my head. Only 1 stone per night. I'd already fixed one earlier. Logged it, photographed it. This would be a second. This would be me choosing to break procedure because it felt useful. I stepped toward the tilted stone anyway. The moment my boot crossed that invisible edge, the woods stopped feeling like woods. Fog thickened around my shins. My tape marker dulled, like my beam didn't want to find it. The distant creak sound vanished, like someone had turned it off. Even the insects seemed to pause, the way they do right before a storm. I crouched by the stone. I should have salted first. I knew that. But I was acting like rules were optional when you were helping. Like Urgency could buy exceptions. My fingers touched the rock through my glove, and the cold hit like a shock. Wet cold in dry air, wrong at the bone. I yanked my hand back. The stone was slick. There was no rain. The ground around it looked darker, damp from underneath, like the earth was sweating. Fear snapped hot in my chest. I turned toward my tape line and saw the marker blinking faintly through the fog, farther than it should have been. I took one step toward it, and the distance stretched again. Not impossible, just cruel. Like the woods were charging me for every foot, making me earn the mistake I'd already made. I tried to pick out the next marker beyond it, the next honest blink that would guide me home. The fog swallowed it. The GPS arrow spun, then pointed deeper into the trees. My tape blinked weak and wrong, like it was on the other side of a window. That was when I understood what I'd done. I hadn't just stepped past my safe line. I'd given the boundary permission to treat me like I belonged on the wrong side. One small break, one rational choice, and the woods answered by changing the rules on me. I forced myself to move. Standing still was how you let the night decide for you. I kept my light low, sweeping for the nearest tape marker, the nearest honest reflection that meant I was still on my own path. The fog thickened and thinned in slow waves, like something breathing around my knees. Every few steps I stopped and looked down at my boots, not because the whistling was back, but because my body had learned the rule the hard way. Boots, ground, markers, reality. The first marker I found wasn't where it should have been. The reflective strip blinked back at me from a branch I didn't remember marking, higher than I'd ever place it, angled wrong, facing sideways. I walked toward it anyway because it was the only anchor I had, and as I got closer, my stomach tightened. It was my tape. Same cut edge, same cheap reflective sheen, same knot where I'd pulled it tight and left a crease. It was mine, but it was on the wrong tree. That's the kind of detail that makes you feel crazy, because it's too specific to be imagination and too impossible to be true. I turned in a slow circle, searching for my other markers, the ones I knew were there. A few glints appeared in the fog, but they didn't line up. They formed a crooked trail that bent away from the cabin, away from the service cut, away from anything that made sense. I checked the GPS again and watched the arrow jitter, then settle on a direction that matched those crooked glints. It was like the woods were offering me a new path. I didn't want a new path. I wanted my path. My mouth tasted metallic. My ears rang faintly, a high, thin tone that wasn't coming from the radio. It was like pressure building behind my eyes. I swallowed hard and took slow breaths through my nose, trying to keep my stomach from turning. I pushed through the fog toward the nearest boundary stone, telling myself I needed something solid to orient on. Stones don't move. Rocks don't lie. That thought felt stupid the second it crossed my mind, because the whole problem was that rocks had already moved. The stone appeared ahead of me, half buried in the slope, the carving worn but readable when my beam hit it. It was the same stone I'd photographed earlier that week, the one with moss patch shaped like a thumbprint and a nick along the bottom edge. I knew it like you know any detail you've stared at too long in the dark, except it was on the wrong side of the terrain. It should have been closer to the service cut. It should have been left of my marker line. Instead, it sat ahead and slightly right, like it had been picked up and set down a dozen yards away while I wasn't looking. I stared at it and felt my pulse in my throat. That was when the boundary slid in my head, not as a concept, but as a thing I could see. Not a straight line on a map, a living edge that could shift, duplicate, overlap itself, and pretend it had always been there. I stepped closer, careful, because my body didn't trust the ground anymore. The air around the stone felt colder than the rest of the woods, not just cold, wrong. The kind of cold you feel when you open a freezer and the air spills out, except there was no door and no reason for it. My breath came out thicker, whiter. I pulled a salt bag with shaking fingers and told myself to slow down. Rule 2. Closed circle. Log the time. If the salt disappears, leave. I opened the bag and sprinkled a thin line around the base. The salt fell clean and bright against the dark soil, and for half a second it looked normal. Then it didn't. The salt vanished. Not melted. Not absorbed. Vanished. One blink and the circle was gone, like the ground had licked it clean. The soil looked unchanged. No dampness, no streak. Just empty where the salt had been. My stomach lurched. The ringing in my ears got louder. The world tilted a fraction, like I'd stood up too fast after being sick. I put a hand on my knee and tried to breathe, but the air felt too heavy, like I was pulling it through wet cloth. This was the sign. Not a suggestion. Not a warning. A hard stop. I keyed the radio without thinking, my thumb slipping once on the button. "Nikki, the stones are wrong," I said. Her response hit instantly, like she'd been listening the whole time, like she'd been waiting for me to cross into this part of the night. "Leave. Now," she said flatly. I swallowed and tried to form a plan, but my thoughts kept breaking apart. I looked at the fog and it looked thicker. I looked at the trees and they looked closer. The pressure in my head made it hard to focus. I felt like I was one bad breath away from throwing up. I forced my eyes back to the stone. I don't know why. Maybe because I needed proof that I wasn't losing my mind. Maybe because part of me still believed I could understand it if I stared long enough. The surface of the rock glistened. There was no rain. My glove wasn't wet. The leaves weren't wet. But the stone looked damp, slick in the beam of my light, like it was sweating cold. The wetness caught my flashlight and threw it back in tiny, sharp highlights that made my eyes ache. The cold around it felt alive, like it had a reach. I leaned closer and my stomach rolled again. The nausea wasn't fear anymore. It was physical, the kind of sick you get from altitude change or bad air. My vision pulsed at the edges. The ringing tone in my ears sharpened into something almost like a whistle, thin and constant inside my skull. I wiped my mouth with the back of my glove and tasted bile. I took my notebook out because that's what I do when I don't know what else to do. Write it down and make it real. But my hand shook so badly the pen scratched lines I couldn't read. I shoved the notebook back into my pocket, angry at myself for caring about neat handwriting while my body was trying to fold. I looked at the stone again and saw the carvings weren't just numbers. Names were cut into it, shallow but clear, like someone had taken a knife and worked patiently. Jesse Rigsby. There were others too, names I didn't recognize, each one in a different hand, different depth, like they'd been added over time. Some letters were clean, some jagged, like different people had carved them, or the same person had carved them on different nights with different levels of panic. Then I saw mine, Brady Whitaker. It wasn't scratched in like a fresh panic mark. It looked settled, like it belonged, like it had been waiting there and I'd just finally been allowed to see it. My throat closed. The world narrowed to the beam of my light, the damp stone and my own name staring back at me from rock that should have been dead. My legs felt weak. The pressure in my head surged. I had to squat for a second just to keep from tipping over. I keyed the radio again, not because I expected comfort, but because I needed an answer that wasn't coming from the woods. "What is this place?" I asked. "A line," she said. The simplicity of it made it worse. Not a haunting, not a curse, a line, a boundary, something drawn and maintained, something enforced. I stared at my name again and felt the truth settle into me, heavy and clear. The boundary isn't keeping people out, it's keeping us in. I didn't know what in meant yet. I didn't know what was on the other side, or if there even was an other side anymore. But I understood the shape of the trap. Jesse hadn't been transferred, not in any way that mattered. Those names weren't memorials. They were anchors. They were proof of who had been used to hold the line in place. My stomach turned again, and I swallowed hard, forcing my body upright. Nikki had said leave now, and for the first time I understood she wasn't giving advice. She was giving me the only move I had left. I didn't look for the county man. I didn't look for the radio voice that sounded like Rawlins. I didn't look for any sign of a hiker, real or fake. I focused on one thing, getting back to the cabin before the woods decided I was part of the stone. I looked down at my boots and started walking. I found the cabin by treating my own fear like a tool. I kept my eyes low and followed what I'd placed with my own hands. I didn't argue with what the woods tried to show me. I didn't chase the crooked glints. I kept my light low and my steps measured until the porch boards finally creaked under my weight and the new lock gleamed in my beam like something solid and real. Inside, I locked the door and set my gear down with hands that didn't feel like mine. The heater ticked and hissed. The radio sat silent. I slid down the wall beside the desk and sat on the floor, knees drawn up back against the wood. I didn't feel brave. I felt used up. I kept my eyes on my boots for a long time, like they were the only thing in the room I could trust. I stayed there until the dark softened and the window glass turned from black to gray. I didn't sleep. Every time my eyes closed, I saw my name carved into wet rock, like it had been waiting for me. The sound of tires on gravel snapped me upright. A vehicle pulled in fast, too fast for the distance and the road. Headlights swept across the cabin walls, and for a second, I thought about not answering, about letting them pass. But the engine cut, and doors opened with that familiar impatience of someone who already decided how this was going to go. Captain Rawlins stepped onto the porch like he'd been there 100 times. He didn't ask if I was okay. He didn't look around like he expected to see anything. He came straight to the point. "Did you fix more than one?" he asked. My mouth went dry. There were a lot of ways to answer that if I wanted to be honest. I'd already broken enough rules for one lifetime. I didn't need to hand him a reason to bury me on paper. "No," I said. "Good." "Then you can go home," he said flatly. He handed me forms without looking at my hands shaking around the edges, a signature line, a date, a section that read like a promise not to talk. I signed because I wanted out more than I wanted justice. He gave me an envelope with the overtime and hazard pay, like it was hush money dressed up as payroll. Then he took my cabin keys off the ring and told me, in a tone that made it sound official, that I'd be reassigned. Different area, different rotation, something normal. I drove back to Beckley with my jaw clenched, trying to keep my mind from replaying the stone. The hospital felt too bright when I walked in, like I'd spent the night in a cave and forgot what white light does to your eyes. Emma smiled when she saw me, and I smiled back, and it took real effort to make it look easy. I sat beside her bed and tried to talk about normal things, work, weather, anything. But my eyes kept catching the edges of the room, the doorway, the threshold strip on the floor, the painted line where tile met baseboard. Every boundary looked sharper than it should, like my brain had been trained to see lines and fear what happens when you cross them. Later, when I left, I reached for the handle on the stairwell door and froze. The metal felt wet cold in my palm, slick in air that was dry and warm. I stood there with my hand on it, breath shallow, listening. Somewhere under the steady hum of the building's HVAC, a thin whistling slid in, soft enough that I could have blamed it on vents or nerves. I didn't. I looked down at my boots without thinking, and for a second, I couldn't remember which side of the line I was supposed to be on.